Bing.
Okay. So, I think this is working. Hi, Nicholas. How are you doing today?
Hi. G'day. Very well, thanks, Peyton.
Good. So, it's great to talk to you today. So I thought
we're now on our best behaviour, having had a backroom conversation before this one.
That's true. Makes it easier to get things going. That's for sure.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. Well, I just thought we could kick things off. Earlier, you were talking to me a little bit about how you don't have a favorite book, which I thought was a very interesting thing to say. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, so I often get asked when people, especially younger people, and they'll talk to me and they'll decide that I've got something to say. They'll decide here's someone who sort of says interesting things and says things that I haven't sort of heard someone else say before. And then they will start plying me sometimes for advice, sort of tips. But also one of the questions is, well, can you recommend, or I might have expressed some interesting ideas to them, and then they'll say, can you tell me some books I can read to really get on top of those ideas? And when it first happened, I thought to myself, well, I felt rather inadequate. I could never think of these books that had changed my life or anything like that. And I put this down to my inherent dullness, I suppose, that I don't seem to, this doesn't seem to happen to me. I could say it's happened to me with regard to people, but then usually not just a few hours exposure to a person, but a much, much longer exposure. But the older I get, the more I think that this just makes perfect sense for me, because all of the whatever pathetic amounts of intellectual growth I can claim to have made comes from figuring stuff out, comes from a series of, a tip, if you like, is so my background was, I'm fond of saying that I'm trained in economics and the only education I ever got was in history. And what history taught me was a few things that you can have. I remember being given in second year history, we had two books, one written by a guy called Hans Baron, and he'd spent the previous 30 and was on the Renaissance in Italy, and he'd made his life's work of this. And then, and so he'd written it when he was 60 or something. And then someone came along a decade or so later and said this was all, just completely debunked it. And we were given these two books and a debate in the journal articles and told to interpret this. And I thought, well, these guys have spent their entire adult lives studying this stuff. Anyway, as I read the sources, I just thought, no, the guy who's debunking the earlier bloke is just right. He's just the earlier bloke is just he's landed these huge blows on what he's saying, and then this other guy, then the guy comes back with sort of excuses and ad hominem and so on. Now that's sort of lesson one, that the learning starts quickly if you're trying to sort of pay attention and sort of, in a little bit of economic jargon, sort of mark individual ideas to market. In other words, say, okay, this is the claim that's made. I'm going to kind of ground truth that claim, and yes, that claim seems to be right, which means that 1/3 of this book is really kind of on the wrong track. The second idea, again from history, is the philosopher Collingwood, R.G. Collingwood, who writes about walking past the Albert Memorial. And I always think of this whenever I see the Albert Memorial in London. And he's walking past the Albert Memorial, and it slowly begins to obsess him because he thinks Gilbert Scott was a great architect. He built this thing. I hate everything about it. How could... And then eventually, and he walks past it every day. He's actually working for intelligence services in World War I. And then one day he's walking past it and he thinks, well, maybe I'm asking the wrong questions. Maybe I need to ask myself, what was he trying to achieve? What was he trying to do? And this, for him, it's his way. I'm sure it's a little bit like we all tell stories which make things rather too neat. But this is a sort of origin story of his whole philosophy of meaning and so on. So what does this mean? It means to me that whenever someone says something that I really strongly disagree with or find very surprising, I firstly ask, do I respect that person? Because a lot of things are said by Donald Trump and any number of other people, and they would say that, wouldn't they? But once it gets through that filter, I then have to ask this Collingwood question, which is to say, well, how are they looking at something differently to the way I'm looking at something? So it's a very long-winded story, but it means that I can read a book and it sort of is there as a set of resources, a set of tools, a set of ideas, but not really a recipe. And I'm just having to do that myself. Yeah. And again, I've got another little formula. I sometimes don't really like these formulas, but there we are. When I say I had to give a talk to economists, young economists recently, and I said, you come out of uni and you think that doing economics in the professional world is 80% what you studied at uni and 20% fitting it to the situation. And most of your peers think that, and so that's kind of what it is, but it really should be the other way around. You've got a set of resources and you've got to come up with productive ways of using those resources to reflect on what is in front of you. And there are so many different ways to do that. And people are not trained in it. That's one of the reasons COVID has been so bad, because bleedingly obvious things to do are not what people have been trained to do, and they don't do them. Oh. Here endeth the lecture. Yeah.
It's interesting to me because, recently I've been working my way through this long autobiographical novel by this Norwegian writer, Karl Ove Knausgaard. I think that's the right way to pronounce it.
Right.
And, his ability to produce writing is just, it's just really, in some ways, unprecedented. He's like, he can write at the speed and with the productivity of some of these, pulp writers of, the early 20th century. Yeah. But at the same time, he produces what, I think you would at least consider pretty high-level literary fiction. It's not, maybe as high level as someone like Melville or some of these other people, or, there are certainly contemporary writers who I think maybe pay more attention to their diction or the written word and things like that. But still, it's very good, in my opinion. And I was reading about, he was talking, when he was younger, he said, when I first was a writer, I would read articles about how other writers did their work, because I was curious, what's the way in which you have to work to become a successful writer. And I think a lot of people get interested in that question. Does this writer use a computer? Does this writer write by hand, or whatever it may be? Or, do they work in the morning? Do they work at night? These kind of endless questions, right? And he said, then I realized every writer is an amateur, And in some ways, I think...
Absolutely, couldn't agree more.
And I think that's really interesting. Like, if you think about it this way, every thinker, even the really great ones, including, of course, going back to people like Plato or, other ancient thinkers or people in the modern era who sort of dominate the philosophical landscape, like Kant or whoever. In some senses, though they may have been in very academic environments, they had to approach their work as amateurs, in a sense. And I don't think they would have made the breakthroughs they had made if they hadn't... if they tried to approach, everything by, okay, this is by the book that I'm going to base everything all my thinking on, or something along these lines.
It's one of the reasons why I really dislike the term expert, because expert carries this idea of credentials, of the body of things that you must know. I think that idea of amateurism is, amateurism, the subtlety of the English language, whether you want to say that someone should be amateurish, but that's absolutely right. If you're doing something, and again, we valorize it with terms like innovation and all this stuff, but it doesn't have to be incredibly innovative. It is, if you are going to think for yourself, you're going to have to be an amateur about most of it. You're going to have to make new starts a lot, and false starts and all that sort of stuff. That's, our intellectual culture, not just within universities. I mean, it's in a terrible state within universities. But generally, I suppose, here's a theory, if you like, that intellectual people trying to figure stuff out is a highly status-conscious activity. Human beings are highly status-conscious, and that then feeds into, people showing that they've read Hannah Arendt and they've read this and they've read that, and then they'll say something's Nietzschean or this, that, and the other. And of course, you want to, you want to be aware of what really thoughtful people have said. And some people, some people have said some amazingly simple and insightful things. But I'm right on the other end of the spectrum. So there's virtually no thinker that I'm really well read in, but I've read lots of thinkers, and I regard myself as, and I talk about lots of thinkers. People will appeal to me, Alistair McIntyre, Aristotle, although most of my ideas from Aristotle are secondhand through McIntyre, Michael Polanyi, R.G. Collingwood, Nietzsche, teensy bit of Foucault, but I don't read. I don't go and get myself. I mean, I tried to read Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, and I've read some big chunks of it, and I've found it very interesting. I'm not going to read my way all through it. I get the idea. I get the idea.
What's from the field of economics, you spoke a little bit about how sometimes the economic, you spoke to me a little bit in another conversation about how sometimes the economic discipline gets so wrapped up in these abstract models and misses, let's say, the real life behavior. I think you mentioned a bank teller or something like this. How do you think this way of approaching, let's say, other thinkers or other disciplines applies to that field?
Okay, so I think if I roughly remember what I said there, which is, and this came from a friend of mine called Henry Ergas, who read it somewhere, and the line of inquiry, the line of critique goes like this. Economics tells you that, or most of economics, the apparatus of economics works on the idea that people follow their self-interest. Now just focus on what a bank teller does. Sits at, let's make him a he in this case, sits at his desk, does stuff, rings people, sees somebody needs service, gets up, serves them at the counter. Now, of course, an economist, if I'm trying to sort of have an argument with an economist will say, yes, that's all. There's a perimeter around that defined by his self-interest. If he doesn't do that reasonably well, he will get sacked. That's true. But within that, there's a huge amount of freedom. And the texture of the bank teller's life is not his self-interest. It is doing his job. Now, economics takes virtually no interest in that at all. If you like, that's a sort of, again, to use a ridiculously long word, that's a phenomenological analysis. But it's, I call it paying attention. It's again, I prefer to quote Jerry Seinfeld. In one of his routines, he says, girls, he's talking about men and women, of course, and he says, girls, do you want to know what we're thinking? And they say yes, and he says, we're not thinking anything. We're just walking around, looking around. So phenomenology, or this approach, what I call paying attention, is walking around, looking around, and looking particularly, and Gillian Tett says something similar, and she's an anthropologist who's written for the Financial Times and has just published a book. I think it's called Anthrovision. And she says, we specialise, I didn't know this, I didn't get taught any anthropology, but we specialise in exploring the territory between what people do and what people tell themselves that they're doing. And I overlay that with a further requirement, because because you can do that in a million different ways, and there are plenty of interesting ways to do it. And if you're a novelist or someone who's trying to sort of enrich our culture, I suppose you can do it, and you can take that in many directions. I'm trying to take it in the direction of usefulness. I'm trying to say that if we have a program where we're trying to reduce recidivism in prisons, where we're trying to address remedial, mental health and dyslexia or whatever, that if at some stage you want to take some tools out of the economist's toolbox and you'll do some statistics on a bunch of populations, you may be able to find out all kinds of really interesting things. But pay attention to all the opportunities that exist that are not in an economics textbook. They're of the essence. Now, then someone can say, well, don't get an economist, get an anthropologist or a specialist in that area. And I don't think that's satisfactory. It's a very good idea not to put economists in charge of this. But I don't think that's at all satisfactory. I think we need to have knowledgeable people who are trying to pay attention to the same problem and help each other do that, and to be useful doing it. And we are a million miles from there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, this idea of, too, like, what was that territory between what people are doing and what they're telling themselves they're doing? Because to me, also, and it kind of gets back to this theme of books, what really is valuable to me when I read a book is, and this often happens when I'm reading fiction, and maybe there's a sense in which studying history brings about the same kind of thing as well, but there's these opportunities to kind of reflect on yourself, and you see a character doing something in a book, and actually this Knausgaard is a really good example of this. You see him doing something in his life and him reflecting on it, and then you have this space to sort of see, there was a gap there with me as well between what I thought I was doing this for and what I was actually doing this for, and to me that's fundamentally, I do think I would say I have a few favorite books, but usually they're works that have brought about that kind of revelation. Well,
I have some favourite books too, and I would say that I can't think of one that's really brought about a big revelation. I mean, Collingwood's autobiography, I've just been rereading a bit of it. Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue. So I have favourite things I can suggest to people. I mean, Nietzsche's On Truth and Lie in an Extramoral Sense is very early. A very early thing in which, in about 8 pages, he says he sort of gets over the essence of all of these ideas that he would develop throughout his life. I mean, just stunning stuff, just completely stunning. So I have favourites, but it may be another way. It may be another way to put this. I know you're interested in Plato's Meno and the idea of education, whether there is such a thing as learning a new thing, or whether it's more like remembering something. And perhaps what I'm saying is that I can't really understand a book until I've done enough thinking so that what I encounter is reminding me not of myself, it's enriching me, but I've got far enough to see that these ideas have some real substance.
Yeah, they sort of become a part of yourself in some sense, right?
Well, I read a book. I remember being hugely impressed by. I might have said this to you before. I remember being hugely impressed by Collingwood, the philosopher R.G. Collingwood, when I was studying history, and I came upon, I don't know, a few decades ago, I came upon an article that he wrote in 1926, I think, called Economics as a Philosophical Science. I thought, beauty. And I read this thing with great anticipation, and I sort of didn't know why he was writing these things. I mean, everything he wrote I could understand. And I then reread it about, you're familiar with some of these ideas that I've worked back to, and in which I've made a big deal of the idea that competition and cooperation are not opposites. They're two sides of the same coin. They mutually define each other. And there in Collingwood, in a sentence in 1926 about economics, he says economics is the world. I don't know whether I can't get it quickly, but economics is the world in which people cooperate to compete, as in a chess game, which summarize, now I knew that someone would have said this before, and I'd made it this very simple idea that there is no cooperation without, that when people cooperate, they define that by cooperating, they define the terms of the cooperation. He's making the same point. Now, I didn't think that this was a brilliant logical insight of mine, but I'd never seen an economist make it think about it and put it in, put it out there and ruminate on, ponder it. And I'm pursuing this idea that it's worth pondering. I'm pursuing this idea that it's worth, this is a great starting point, a great place to start, or one place to start among a number, to think about economic phenomena, what constitutes them, how we can optimize them for our own well-being, and so on. So there you are. That's a nice illustration of Menno, that I couldn't understand it until I was remembering having thought of it myself, or thought of something similar. And again, I mentioned Michael Polanyi, and Michael Polanyi makes this statement that scandalized Karl Popper, and he described himself as an Augustinian, and it was Saint Augustine, who said, "Until you believe, you cannot understand." And of course, people with a weak grasp of science think that that's obscurantist and sort of absurd and occult. And of course, it's nothing of the kind. And now you can agree or disagree, or it's really, it's not the kind of thing I want to agree or disagree with. It's a starting point. That's what it is, a starting point for thought. So yes, I don't know whether you want me to explain that further. I suspect you understand it, but if anyone ever listens to this, they may not. So maybe I should. My instinct is to say that maybe I should say a bit more. But anyway, maybe you should say a bit more. Maybe you should say what you make of that idea.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I'm also working to kind of think through some of the implications to it, because there's certainly an aspect to that resonates. And, it reminds me of some concerns that are sometimes overblown and sometimes very legitimate, let's say, about the idea, I guess, of cultural appropriation in some sense. If I am, let's say, not a member of a community, and I start to wear clothing associated with the community or something along these lines. And I don't mean this in an extremely political sense, and I'm not trying to address when this is inappropriate, but the idea of, I think the objection at some level is that here's someone who is doing this and acting like they understand, but they don't understand. They just sort of like something they see, but they don't understand it because they don't have that belief, or they don't have that investment or that identity that's rooted in this idea. And so, I usually, and I never really thought of this as a potentially kind of Platonic idea in some senses, but it kind of is, in that. And it's this weird inversion of Plato, because in some ways with Plato, everything becomes detached from culture. You have these pure forms that don't, you can appreciate roundness, whether you're from one country or from another country, or from one culture, another culture. It doesn't change what roundness is, let's say, for example. But if you are, let's say, trying to express an idea, or to use a kind of way of thinking or way of expressing oneself, and you've acquired that knowledge through some means other than, let's say, this process of, let's say, remembering it or somehow or connecting it with your identity, there's something kind of cheap about that I think that's and also, in some ways, you might even, to kind of bring it back to this discussion of, let's say, an academic discipline, in some ways, perhaps an academic discipline could be used as a mechanism for acquiring, let's say, these kinds of these ornaments of identity without kind of going through the process of let's say, acquiring them internally. So I don't know if I have a great example off the top of my head, but you could certainly see examples of this if you look at, let's say, early, it's easy to look at, let's say, late 19th century scholarship or something along the lines where, there's a famous figure in Japan. He was an Irishman who came and he sort of adopted the Japanese way of life of Cardio Hearn. And he wrote some famous books about Japanese culture. And, they are, I think that they are open to critique, having been written by an outsider. And I'm sure there's people who would have called this some form of cultural imperialism, a guy from the West, but then I do think there is a sense in which his acquisition of these cultural, or like at least his attempt to acquire this Japanese cultural lifestyle or way of life was sincere and not necessarily motivated by a kind of sense of colonialism or trying to take something over that wasn't his. So, but it's an interesting question. But he took a kind of academic route. I believe he was tenured at the University of Tokyo, and that's where or what it used to be called, something like the Imperial University or something like this. But I wonder if if we're looking, at the way in which academics approach different cultural phenomenon, in 100 years we might see similar, a similar we might see similar patterns emerge or something.
Yeah, I'm maybe it's because I think it's likely that because I'm reacting to it partly as a political agenda, and I think it's likely to. It's not that it is without merit as a political agenda. We can all understand the idea. But to put it in a political context in which one is judging the merits of someone doing something and then thinking about whether it be kind of prohibited or cancelled or whatever you want to say, I suspect that's likely to generate lots more harm than good. But the basic idea, I think, is a very important one. And the way I would put it is that, and I got a really nice kind of analogy to draw here. So I increasingly, on places like Twitter, I mean, not that I get into too many scraps, but someone was sort of demanding that I explain myself about a particular thing. And I knew, because I was talking about, you might talk about, one of these things that people get themselves very excited about, like whether, reality exists outside of our brains, and obviously, or, and then they say things like, well, did Jupiter have as many moons before we knew how many moons it had? And the answer is yes, of course. So my response to that is, in fact, I mentioned it early on, which is that if some postmodernist French philosopher who I have checked out and don't think is just a bullshit artist, and I think maybe some of them are, or there's a fair bit of bullshit in there, but there are plenty who are not, and then there are people who are not even French. Not obviously, well, just the pragmatists and so on. And the American pragmatists are not trying to bullshit anyone. They're trying to be more specific about what the truth means, and they come to certain conclusions. Now, if I'm going to argue about something difficult like that, I certainly wouldn't tell you I'm some authority on it. I'm not going to duke it out in an argument, because they're not going to fucking well understand it. They won't even understand it to the level that I do understand it, and I don't understand it all that well. Yeah. And so I've taken, on occasion, on Twitter and various other places, when someone starts amping this up, and we might, and I might have talked about some thinker saying something, and then I say, well, you tell me, you try and put what they're trying to say in its best possible light. Once you've done that, let's talk. That shuts them up because they have nothing to say at that point. But the analogy here is that, and I'm sure this is by no means unique to Australian Indigenes, but in Australian Indigenous knowledge, there are all kinds of knowledges tucked away, and you don't get to know anything about them until and unless, I mean, if you're a man, you don't find out about a whole lot of women's knowledge. If you're a woman, vice versa. And then when you're a young man, presumably it's the same with young women, but I was reading on the weekend about Aboriginal initiation, and it's rather, it's very Australian. Much more downbeat than the sort of dramatic American Indigenes, and the sort of Joseph Campbell backdrop, that we can't get out of our heads. It's much more. It's kind of more like Monty Python. There are kind of extraordinary things going on, very dramatic, theatrical things. They get scared witless and then find out that what they thought happened hadn't happened. It's an extraordinary performance. And the adolescent boys go up to the week on which this happens knowing none of this. It's just extraordinary. And so this idea that you are admitted into knowledge when you are ready to start to apprehend it is a fabulous one. And, of course, modern reductive liberalism is a complete parody of that, which is that you have a free market in ideas, and someone who shows some care about such things is supposed to debate Donald Trump or anyone else who's been paid, a member of the tobacco lobby or whoever. I mean, I don't want to just pick right-wing bad guys that, a wokey. It's a completely farcical activity, absolutely farcical activity. There's another principle, since I was talking about principles early on. which is a principle that's enunciated in a Monty Python sketch, in which the two characters say, I think this sketch has got too silly. And then the other one says, well, I think we better end it then. And then the other one says, okay, and then the screen goes black. So we should do a lot more of that when you find and of course you can get caught up with it with your emotions and so on, but I'm not trying to give personal advice. I'm giving advice to the entire political world here, that when you're engaged in a completely nonsensical argument in which no one's in good faith, and that's like most of the arguments in our uninhabitable political culture, just stop. Now, if you represent a cause, you're a bit conflicted because you might want to try and defend your cause. But most people should just stop, because it's not human life. It's like a corpse that's having electric currents put through it.
Yeah, it's I think it's kind of I know our theme in a way was to speak a little bit about how let's say the difference between this kind of knowledge that's acquired, maybe we could say earned in a sense, even though this term you like to use is paying attention. You're actually, let's say, you're actually paying something to acquire this knowledge, versus, let's say,
the Christian theology has the idea of bearing witness, which is different again, but it's a similar. It's there's something of you in there. It's not all. It's not all out there. You're intensely involved, and if you're not, you haven't turned up.
Yeah, and it seems like this kind of environment where the ability to do this has to be based in, let's say, more of a cooperative atmosphere than if, let's say, you believe exclusively in this marketplace of ideas, and all these ideas are kind of competing with each other, and then the best ideas, they somehow, by some mechanism it's not completely clear, they sort of beat the worst ideas, and then you just have good ideas in the end. But as we know, maybe something like that could work if the environment was very cooperative and people all agreed. For example, we're going to avoid certain kinds of rhetorical approaches, or try to limit the way in which we attempt to persuade people, and to a subset of let's say for example, a structured debate or something along these lines, where you have these Robert's rules of order or something along these lines that keep everybody from just moving from ad hominem attacks to arguments about the motivation of an argument or something like this.
So I'm just looking something up. What I would say is, firstly, your appeal to cooperation, I think, is exactly right. And that's kind of the way I used to express this as, do we have dialogue as contest or dialogue as cooperation? Now, there's a couple of additional things I'd like to say about that. Now, I read a really nice speech by a philosopher called Christopher Fear, I think, and he's at the University of Hull. And it's actually a speech that he gives. It's got a terrible title, I think. It's called The Philosophy of Philosophy. It's a fine speech, and he talks about meeting two people on a train, and they say, "What do you do?" And he says, "I'm a philosopher." And they say, "What do you do?" What does that mean? And he says he was so ashamed of his answer, which I think he said things like, we look at the big picture and we do this, that, and the other. And he ends up talking about this term that I hadn't run into, and it's used by Collingwood, R.G. Collingwood, who I keep mentioning. And this bloke's another fan of his, and that explains what I was doing reading this speech. And he talks about the difference between Aristical and dialectical dialogue, and I didn't know what Aristical is, but it comes from and maybe Collingwood coined the expression, it comes from the Greek, where the root is for strife. And Aristical competition Aristical dialogue, Aristical discussion is discussion as competition, and it is a discussion between two people who defend two propositions, and one wins and the other loses, or they walk off and agree to differ. And he contrasts this with dialectic. And of course, we've now, in modern times, people who fancy themselves as thinkers know, that dialectic, I mean, I certainly had in my own mind the idea of dialectic as relating to Hegel and Marx coming after Hegel. And there's, whether or not those two folks deserve this or not, there is a kind of an occult quality to the idea of the Hegelian dialectic. It's a nice thing to say. It enabled Marx to say he was being truly scientific, whereas other people were just arguing. Yes, and so it inculcates an idea, a sort of cultish idea that this is an alternative logic, and it gives you this key. And I didn't really fully take on board the idea that this really comes from Socrates. And Socrates' idea, to some extent, it's hard, I think Socrates gets rather too good a press in a lot of ways, but I love this idea that two people can think they're disagreeing, and the task is to work out how it is that they really agree. Yeah. I mean, that is sublime. That's just wonderful. Yeah. And it's usually the case. It's obviously not the case totally. Mm-hmm. And even if it's, and even if you want to quibble with that description, isn't that so much better description of how people can learn from each other? So that's the first point. And then the second point is really, and again, I'm saying it's nice that I'm able to give examples of this, because I don't know whether Michael Polanyi got me thinking about this or whether I just sort of was thinking about it and then picked up stuff he wrote. But about this idea, and I really want to write something about this, and I've sort of earmarked it in my own head to do it, and I've written 3 essays so far that I haven't published, and they're a bit shit-ass. Because I really, but I want to propose an idea, which is that we always express our dissatisfaction with our public life and our democracy as in egalitarian terms. We express it in terms of fairness and what about us? What about me? It's unfair to me. And I suspect that the reason people are so upset and the lack that they feel, they can't even articulate. So far has this thing sunk from our discourse that it's unthinkable and unspeakable. But it is speakable. I'm going to speak to you now. And it is that we don't just lack equality. Our democracy hasn't just become far less equal over the last few decades, maybe over the last 2 centuries. It's become its relationship to virtue has simply, it doesn't exist as a concept. It exists as a rhetorical move. I'm right and you're wrong. I did the right thing, you did the wrong thing. There is no sense in which our politics is a theatre and a world in which virtue strives for its own realisation. And thinkers, including some democratic, certainly founders of modern democracy, even though they weren't democratic thinkers. I'm thinking people like Jefferson, But that was what the American founding fathers put their faith in, that the process of elections would select out from the community a natural aristocracy. That's all about virtue. That's all about a polity, a political community. The idea is that a political community that cannot be virtuous cannot govern itself, and will not only be poor, nasty, brutish and short, but also miserable. So that's a nice thing to... Anyway, that's possibly an introduction to another conversation we plan to have. To bring it back to Polanyi, Michael Polanyi, he argued that science couldn't get by without a high... I mean, he was okay with science being somewhat competitive, couldn't get it by without a high degree of cooperation, and that it was a striving for transcendent human value of truth. In other words, it was a theatre of virtue. And I might just read you, if I haven't gone on too long, I will read you, if I can find it quickly enough, a passage from Michael Polanyi about, which is brilliantly prophetic, because he's writing, I think, in the 1950s, and he's saying you cannot leave science just even to peer review. You cannot leave science just to the opinion of scientists. If scholars fall in love with what other scholars think of them, of course they can't help but be influenced by that, and that's a good thing. If they make that their number one objective, the place will fall apart, very much as it is doing. I'll see if I can get you the right term. If science, so this is my words, and then the next paragraph is Polanyi's. If scientists sought other scientists' approval rather than putting themselves to the test of seeking their deserved approval, that's an idea of Adam Smith's, by the way, science would be loosed from its fiduciary moorings, debased. Those scientists' income independence influence their whole whole standing in the world will depend on the amount of credit they could gain in other scientists' eyes. They must, quote, must not aim primarily at this credit, but only at satisfying the standards of science. Polanyi goes on. The quickest impression on the scientific world may be made by serving up an interesting and plausible story composed of parts of the truth with a little straight invention admixed to it. Such a composition, if judiciously guarded by interspersed ambiguities, will be extremely difficult to controvert and may stand for years unchallenged. A considerable reputation can be built up and a very comfortable university post gained before this kind of swindle transpires, if it ever does. If each scientist set to work every morning to do the best bit of safe charlatanry which could just help him get into a good post, there would soon exist no effective standards by which such deception could be detected. And our democracy is a little the same.
Well, I think that's really good, and this might be a good point for us to pause our conversation. But I think we have a lot more things to talk about in future discussions. So thank you very much, and we'll talk to you.
Thank you.
Soon.
Thanks, Peyton.